Industrial espionage from China is something that's popped up over the years in both news accounts, but also media. The idea that secrets and technology, sometimes from the military, are being secreted away. But what's the reality? What has actually been going on over the past few decades? What does it look like now? We're joined by journalist and author of The Scientist and the Spy, Mara Hvistendahl. Welcome back to the Damage Report.
Thank you for having me on the show again.
Very glad to have you here. So the topic is obviously very dramatic, but you have an account of real people, real instances going back literally decades. Give us an idea of what the reality is like.
Sure. My book starts with a man named Robert Moe, who was found in a field in Iowa in 2011. This was a Monsanto cornfield that the company protected as trade secrets. They were growing genetically modified inbred corn there. And his appearance in that field set off a 2-year FBI investigation that involves car chases, surveillance planes overhead, flying overhead, and even the use of a FISA warrant, which is typically reserved for extreme national security threats. So the US government treated this as a major threat, and I set out to find out why.
So, I guess the immediate follow-up question is why is it being treated in that fashion? I guess the intellectual seed property that we're talking about here, how significant is that in terms of like the national security of the United States, even its economic sort of import?
Well, over the past few decades, we've seen this shift from the US government treating things like terrorism and so forth as national security to including trade secret theft and industrial espionage in the list of extreme national security threats. There have been dozens of cases involving China brought in the last few years. The FBI Director Christopher Wray recently said that there are over 1,000 active cases. And I was living as a reporter in China when I first heard about Robert Moe's case. I reported on science and research, and then suddenly my beat was in the international news and had become this major focus for the US government. The argument is that people like him are targeting the US innovation in infrastructure, that they are taking money away from average Americans, and that justifies the US government going after these perpetrators. But what I found is that the story is actually a lot more complicated.
Okay, well, clearly I want to follow up on that, but I'm curious, you talk about 1,000 current cases. This is obviously something that they're focusing on far more in recent years. Is it something that they've gotten a handle on? Is China changing its practices? Is this as common as it once was?
Well, certainly there is a lot of industrial espionage happening from China. There is a major emphasis on technology from the Chinese government. And so far, this FBI effort has not stopped that drain. The question I wanted to ask in the book is, what is the collateral damage of our focus on these cases? Are there people who are getting hurt? And is this use of resources, as happened in the Robert Moe case, is that a good use? Is that where American taxpayers' dollars should be spent?
And I'm curious because obviously there are a lot of countries that we work with on projects that we sell military technology to that theoretically could be reverse engineered. And you write in your book, I'm curious about China as opposed to some of these other cases. You write in the book that much of US counterintel policies were tinged with racism. So through your analysis, how important was racism in our reaction to countries like China versus other countries that might also be engaging in industrial espionage?
Well, so when I set out to tell this story of Robert Moe, I reported it from all sides. I really retraced his steps, and it's just an extremely colorful story. Tried to tell it scene by scene, almost like a thriller, so that the readers would get kind of a dose of geopolitics in a really, hopefully, riveting book. But along the way, people told me I should go back and look at the history of how the FBI has treated Chinese American scientists. People started coming to me with stories of their family members who had been surveilled or hounded in some cases through the 1960s up to the 1980s. Using a Freedom of Information Act request, I discovered that this was actually a dedicated program to surveil Chinese American scientists, including US citizens.
And is there any indication that something like that might be continuing to the present day?
There are a number of community groups and Congress people who are certainly concerned that it is continuing. There have been cases in just the past few years where scientists were charged with a very serious crime, and then charges were entirely dropped because it turned out that they were innocent and the FBI had gotten the science wrong. So these are incredibly complex cases. They require the FBI to understand China, understand technology, and understand intellectual property law, which are very complicated things.
And look, I understand that the going into it, the goal was mainly about understanding this, presenting it, all of that. But based on your analysis, do you have any sort of suggestions for what could be done in the future to get us to a place where we're not just investigating and stopping the industrial espionage, but it isn't as big of a factor in the relationship between China and the US?
Mm-hmm. Well, when you look at protecting innovation, which is what the US government says is the ultimate goal of these efforts, in something like the seed industry, corporate consolidation is actually a much bigger threat to to average Americans and to farmers. So companies like Monsanto have only gotten bigger over the past few years. And there's this irony in the book where by the end of my reporting, Monsanto had been acquired by Bayer and was no longer even American. Oh. So the US government had spent massive amounts of money defending this company that was no longer on US soil.
Interesting. Okay, so I can certainly see some implications going on from the future. Mara, I want to thank you for joining us on the show today. The book is The Scientist and the Spy, a true story of China, the FBI, and industrial espionage. Thank you once again.
Well, thank you so much for having me again.
For more political news, breakdowns, interviews, stories of activism, and me trying my hardest to care about the occasional big celebrity news story, subscribe to our YouTube channel at youtube.com/The Damage Report. And you can ring the bell wherever it is so you don't miss anything.